British journalist Tom Grossi is live with us now to discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He joins us from Tel Aviv, Israel. Good afternoon, Tom. Thanks for joining us on NewsHour.
Good afternoon.
Now, Western leaders and their media outlets have covered this war in detail and from the worst affected areas. Now, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said the West's war is against Putin and the Russian government, but not against the Russian people. So how would you analyse the overall reaction from leaders, the media and society in the West?
Well, what Russia is doing in Ukraine is, of course, terrible, and it's very good that people are concerned. But at the same time, I would say some of the reaction in the West is really a little bit hysterical and not helping to calm nerves and bring about a possible resolution. I mean, I'll give you a few examples. Yesterday, the Times of London, which is usually a moderate and level-headed newspaper, its two main headlines on its website, I've got them here, I'll show you. One spoke of genocide, and the other said that Putin was a Nazi. So those are the two main headlines on the Times of London. Well, yesterday, the UN announced that the civilian death toll so far since Russia invaded Ukraine, a country of 44 million, almost a week ago, had risen to 227 deaths. Most were killed by Russian forces, but some, like the Israeli citizen who was shot after being mistaken for a Chechen, were killed by Ukrainian forces. Ukraine says the civilian death toll is higher and could be as high as 2,000, but they also claim that 6,000 Russian troops have been killed, and I suspect the UN figure is more accurate. But in any case, neither of these figures amount to genocide or what happened in World War II or the Holocaust or something. And in fact, for Western journalists and politicians to make sort of allusions to the Holocaust is a form of Holocaust distortion. In fact, this war has not even been anything like Russia's bombardment of Syria or Chechnya, or indeed NATO's own bombardment of Libya, Afghanistan, even Serbia, or the American bombing of Iraq. So we of course don't want it to get worse, but I don't think over-exaggerating at this point helps. This is not World War II, however much people are claiming it is. Of course, I should point out that Russia, too, is very inflammatory, and Putin made stupid remarks about Ukrainians being Nazis and so on. I'm simply pointing out that the West, too, are being rather emotional. And some of the reaction, again, is ridiculous in my view. For example, yesterday, a university in Italy suspended a course on the classic Russian writer Dostoevsky, who died in 1881 and was, imprisoned by the Tsar because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine in 2022. So, I mean, it's nonsense to suspend a course on Dostoevsky. I mean, why don't we ban Shakespeare because Britain bombed Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya? And now, today I heard calls to ban disabled Russian athletes from the Winter Paralympics, which start tomorrow in Beijing. But I mean, why not ban China itself over their appalling treatment of the Uyghurs or Tibet? And of course, there are many, many conflicts going on around the world all the time. America attacks Somalia, Saudi Arabia attacks Yemen, Azerbaijan attacks Armenia, and so on. And they're hardly mentioned in the media, whereas there is almost 24-hour news coverage of the Ukrainian conflict. I understand, of course, why there is that conflict, but there's a risk in overdoing it too. And I don't know how I would feel if I was a Syrian or Iraqi refugee. As I'm sure you all remember, a few weeks ago, refugees tried to cross into Poland from Belarus, and they were severely beaten back by Polish riot police, and several children were actually left to freeze to death on the Polish border. And we still have Afghans who helped NATO countries not being allowed in. Not to mention, of course, millions of homeless people in America and other Western countries. But meantime, Airbnb is offering free apartments to any Ukrainians who are freely allowed into Europe. And transport networks say that if you show a Ukrainian passport, you don't have to, for example, pay a tram fee in Prague, and so on. So in my view, it's important there is this reaction. What Russia doing is, of course, totally wrong, but it's also a somewhat emotional, over-the-top reaction in the West too.
Okay, Tom, firstly, I just want to say thank you for actually highlighting that about the Syrian and Iraqi refugees' distress being less important than the distress of, say, a Ukrainian refugee, because a person is in distress is a person in distress. So that was a very important point. Thanks for that. And just...
I might just one thing. I also would add that thousands of African refugees and migrants have died in the Mediterranean, and it's barely covered in the press in Europe, as they're trying to get into Europe, where there's round-the-clock coverage of people fleeing a so far much less deadly conflict in Ukraine.
Okay, yep, absolutely. And also, as you mentioned, the West being a little bit too hysterical about what's happening at the moment. And there's a lot of conflicting sentiment there, would you agree? When the United States and the EU, but more so the United States, I think, when Joe Biden said in Congress the other day, we're after them and we will come and get them, when he was talking about the sanctions, and particularly the sanctions on the business people and going after the wealth of these Russian oligarchs. In spite of this, there's really not much being done to help the Ukrainians as such, is there? I mean, what is he doing? What are they doing for the Ukrainians exactly?
Well, there's humanitarian help, and they're certainly helping those who manage to leave the country. And there's certainly a lot of moral support. We have Ukrainian flags being waved all over the place in Europe and America. We had, I think, in the Metropolitan Opera in New York, they sang the Ukrainian national anthem after the performance there a couple of days ago. And there are the projections of the Ukrainian flag on important public buildings in many European countries. But you're right in the sense that no European or NATO country is going to go to war with Russia, and they've maybe misled the Ukrainians in thinking they will do more than provide a certain number of arms. So in other words, the West is quite happy to let Ukraine fight Russia on its behalf. But I think it's not that I'm not sympathetic with Ukraine, I am. The problem is Russia is a much more powerful nuclear-armed power that is run in a very ruthless way by Vladimir Putin. And I think that the West, I keep on hearing Western media and politicians saying that Putin has miscalculated, and maybe he has, but I also fear that the West is miscalculating here. And if they don't give Putin some way out, if they in effect corner him, I fear he will escalate this severely and unleash much deadlier forces on Ukraine, and this conflict could drag on for years and get much worse than it is at the present time. And it seems to me that they could have provided help to Ukraine to strengthen its democracy, to help Ukraine become less corrupt, more Western, more democratic, without pushing for this NATO membership that the Russians fear. I don't think it's just Putin. I think it's a Russian national interest not to be surrounded by NATO countries, just like it would be an American national interest for Mexico not to station Chinese troops, and for Canada not to station Russian